The distant rumble of thunder rolled across the Montana sky as Meredith Owens clutched her reticule tighter, painfully aware of the footsteps echoing behind her on Gold Hill's deserted Main Street. She'd stayed too late at the schoolhouse, and now dusk was falling, bringing with it dangers that a young schoolteacher from Boston had been repeatedly warned about but had foolishly disregarded. Montana Territory, 1876. Gold Hill had sprung up like a determined weed among the foothills of the Rockies when gold was discovered 7 years prior. The boom had subsided to a steady pulse, leaving behind a town that teetered between civilization and lawlessness, especially after sundown. "Well, look who's out past her bedtime," a voice slurred from the shadows between the mercantile and the assayer's office. Meredith quickened her pace, her heart pounding beneath her modest blue dress. She was still 3 blocks from Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, and the street ahead looked ominously empty. "Hey, schoolmarm." Another voice joined the first, and Meredith caught a whiff of whiskey as 2 men stepped onto the boardwalk ahead of her. She recognized them as regulars from the Broken Spur saloon trouble with boots and unkempt beards. "We're just wanting some education ourselves." Meredith turned sharply down an alley, realizing too late it was a mistake. The narrow passage between buildings ended at a stack of crates and barrels. The sound of laughter behind her confirmed her worst fears. "Nowhere to run now, Miss Fancy Words," said the taller man, his face half hidden beneath a filthy hat. "Just want to have a friendly conversation about them books you're always carrying." "Please," Meredith said, backing against the wall, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. "My absence will be noted. People will come looking." "Let them look," said the second man, shorter but broader with a scar bisecting one eyebrow. "We'll be done getting acquainted by then." Meredith scanned desperately for a weapon, finding nothing but shadows and dirt. The taller man lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with calloused fingers. She screamed, the sound piercing the twilight air, before his other hand clamped roughly over her mouth. The distinct click of a revolver being cocked froze all 3 of them. "I believe the lady isn't interested in your company," came a steady voice from the alley entrance, "and I'm not much interested in asking twice." The man holding Meredith's wrist spun toward the voice, inadvertently pulling her around with him. Through her terror, she saw a tall figure silhouetted against the fading light of the street. His stance was casual, but the Colt in his hand was unwavering. "This ain't your business, stranger," growled the shorter man, though he'd taken a step back. "I'm making it my business." The stranger stepped forward, and Meredith caught her first clear glimpse of him. Tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by years of hard work, not bar fights. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were clear and sharp beneath the brim of a dust-covered hat. He wore no badge, just trail-worn clothes and a gun belt that looked like a natural extension of his body. "2 against 1, mister," said the taller man, though his grip on Meredith had loosened. "Poor odds," agreed the stranger. "For you." He shifted slightly, and something in his movement made both men tense. "Now you've got 3 seconds to let the lady go and disappear." 1. "You think you're 2?" The taller man released Meredith's wrist and raised both hands. "Come on, Brett," he muttered to his companion. "Ain't worth getting shot over." The shorter man, Brett, spat on the ground but stepped back. "Another time, schoolmarm," he growled, before both men sidled past the stranger, giving his gun a wide berth. Only when their footsteps had faded did the stranger holster his weapon. He remained at a respectful distance, watching Meredith with eyes that were assessing but not intrusive. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked. Meredith touched her wrist, already showing finger-shaped bruises. "No, I thank you. I don't know what would have happened if." "Best not to dwell on it," He gestured toward the street. "May I escort you home?" "Those two might think better of returning, but I wouldn't wager your safety on it." She studied him for a moment. He wasn't like the coarse miners or the flashy gamblers that populated Gold Hill. There was something measured about him, as if he'd seen enough trouble to know its worth and found it wanting. "Yes, please. I'm staying at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house on Pine Street." He nodded, offering her his arm but not insisting when she hesitated. "Ethan Vaughn," he said simply. "Meredith Owens." She took his arm, finding it solid and reassuring. "I teach at the schoolhouse." "I gathered that much." There was a hint of a smile in his voice as they emerged onto the street. "Most folks around here don't use words like absence will be noted when they're scared." Meredith felt a flush that wasn't entirely from the lingering fear. Force of habit. "I find proper language maintains civility." Did it work with those two? Evidently not, she admitted, finding herself almost smiling despite the circumstance. "Your revolver was far more persuasive." They walked in silence for a moment, the town around them settling into evening. Lanterns flickered to life in windows, and the distant piano from the broken spur floated through the air. "You're new to Gold Hill," Ethan observed. "Is it that obvious?" Meredith sighed. "I arrived 3 weeks ago. The town council wrote to my university in Boston, seeking a teacher. They mentioned nothing about avoiding certain alleys after sunset. Most places have their dangers." His eyes scanned the street ahead of them. "Even Boston, I'd wager." "True, but they're the dangers wear finer clothes and attack with words rather than whatever those men intended." She shuddered slightly. Ethan's arm tensed beneath her hand. "Those two work for Carson at the mine. He doesn't exactly hire for gentlemanly qualities. You know them." "I know of them. I make it my business to know who might be trouble." They reached the neat white building that housed Mrs. Holloway's respectable boarding house for ladies. Light spilled from the windows, and the sound of female voices drifted from inside. Meredith felt safety beckoning, yet strangely reluctant to end this unexpected encounter. "Thank you again, Mr. Vaughn. I don't know how to repay such a service." "No payment necessary. Just perhaps consider carrying something for protection, or finding a companion for your evening walks." His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. Gold Hill's not all bad men and dark alleys, but it's still growing into its manners. Meredith found herself studying his face, trying to place his accent. Not Western-born, she suspected, but long adapted to it. "Are you passing through town, Mr. Vaughn?" "For now. I have business with the Rockingham Ranch outside town, might be here a while." The door to the boarding house opened suddenly, spilling more light onto the porch. Mrs. Holloway's substantial figure appeared, hands on her hips. "Miss Owens." "We were about to send for the sheriff. It's well past." She stopped, noticing Ethan. Her expression shifted from concern to suspicion. "And who might you be, sir?" "Just making sure Miss Owens arrived home safely, madam," Ethan said, tipping his hat. "Evening to you both." With a slight nod to Meredith, he turned and walked back toward Main Street, his stride unhurried. Mrs. Holloway clucked her tongue. "Come inside this instant. Decent women aren't seen with strange men after dark." But as she ushered Meredith through the door, she added in a lower voice, "Though I must say, if one must be escorted by a stranger, one could do worse. He has the look of a man who knows how to handle trouble." "Yes," Meredith agreed quietly, watching Ethan's tall figure disappear into the gathering night. "I believe he does." Meredith found sleep elusive that night. Each time she closed her eyes, she relived the terror of the alley, followed by the steady voice that had cut through her fear. Mrs. Holloway had insisted on examining her bruised wrist and applying witch hazel, all while delivering a lecture on the importance of returning to the boarding house before twilight. The other boarders 2 seamstresses, and the telegraph operator's widow had gathered around with expressions of horror and fascination as Meredith recounted her ordeal. "It's that Carson," Mrs. Holloway had declared, pressing her lips into a thin line. "Bringing in all manner of ruffians to work his mine. The town council should do something." "Frederick Carson is the town council," Mrs. Porter, the widow, had reminded her. "Or most of it, anyway." Morning brought no reprieve from the previous night's excitement. Word had spread through Gold Hill's efficient gossip network, and by the time Meredith reached the schoolhouse, several concerned mothers were waiting to express their outrage and relief in equal measure. Sheriff Thomas appeared mid-morning, interrupting her lesson on long division to take her statement. "I'll have a word with those boys," he promised, though something in his manner suggested to Meredith that the word would be perfunctory at best. "Carson doesn't like his men being accused of troublemaking." "They weren't accused, Sheriff. They were caught in the act," Meredith pointed out, keeping her voice low so the children couldn't overhear. Sheriff Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "And this stranger who intervened, Vaughn, you said? Where might I find him?" He mentioned business with the Rockingham Ranch, Mason's Place. The sheriff's expression changed slightly. "Interesting. Well, I'll look into it, Miss Owens. Meanwhile, you'd best stick to daylight hours for your comings and goings." The rest of the school day passed in a blur of arithmetic, geography, and surreptitious glances from her pupils, who had clearly heard fragments of the previous night's events. By the time the last child had been collected by their mother, Meredith was exhausted. She was carefully packing her books when a shadow darkened the schoolhouse doorway. Her heart leapt before she could master it, but it wasn't Ethan Vaughn who stood there. Instead, a well-dressed man of perhaps 40 with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority removed his hat and stepped inside. "Miss Owens, Frederick Carson. I own the Golden Summit Mine." His smile was practiced, but didn't quite reach his eyes, which assessed her with uncomfortable directness. "I wanted to personally express my regret over the incident last night. The men responsible have been spoken to." "Spoken to?" Meredith echoed, suddenly conscious that she was alone in the schoolhouse with yet another stranger. "They attempted to assault me, Mr. Carson." Carson waved a dismissive hand. "Young men, too much whiskey." Not excusable, of course, but hardly the serious matter some in town are making it out to be. His smile tightened. "I understand a drifter interfered. Drew a gun, I'm told." "He prevented a crime," Meredith corrected, gathering her books more quickly now. "Indeed." Carson moved further into the room, examining the children's artwork pinned to the walls with the air of someone evaluating livestock. "Gold Hill has procedures for handling such matters. The sheriff, the town council. Vigilantism leads to complications." "There wasn't time for procedures, Mr. Carson." He turned back to her, his smile gone. "Miss Owens, you're new to our community. I've invested considerably in Gold Hill's future. That requires stability, order. When outsiders take matters into their own hands, it disrupts that order." Meredith straightened her spine, channeling the authority she used with unruly students. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Carson, but I have a rather long walk home, and I'd prefer to complete it before dark." Something flickered across Carson's face, annoyance, perhaps, or calculation. But he stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. "Of course, allow me to offer you a ride in my carriage. It's just outside." "Thank you, but I prefer to walk. The fresh air clears my mind after a day of teaching." "As you wish." He replaced his hat. "I do hope you'll consider what I've said. Gold Hill values your contribution as a teacher, but frontier towns require adaptation from those used to Eastern sensibilities." Meredith waited until Carson's carriage had pulled away before leaving the schoolhouse, her nerves jangling. Something in his manner had unsettled her more than the previous night's attack. Those men had been crude and dangerous, but straightforward in their menace. Carson's concern had felt like a warning draped in politeness. She was so distracted that she almost collided with the figure waiting at the bottom of the schoolhouse steps. "Mr. Vaughn," she gasped, clutching her books tighter. Ethan touched the brim of his hat. He looked even taller in daylight, his features more defined. Clean-shaven, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned, though at the moment he was doing neither. "Miss Owens, thought you might appreciate some company on your walk home." Meredith hesitated. "Did Mrs. Holloway send you?" A brief smile touched his mouth. "No, madam. Just seemed prudent, given yesterday's events." His gaze shifted to the road where Carson's carriage was disappearing. "I see you've met our local mining magnate." "Yes, he came to apologize for his men's behavior." She fell into step beside Ethan, noting he had positioned himself between her and the street, though it felt more like a warning to avoid making trouble. "Carson doesn't like complications to his plans," Ethan said mildly, though something in his tone suggested deeper knowledge. "How's your wrist?" Meredith glanced at the bruises, now a mottled purple beneath her sleeve. "It will heal. My pride suffered worse damage, I think. I should have known better than to take that alley. Knowledge comes at a cost sometimes. At least the lesson wasn't harder." They walked in companionable silence for a moment. The afternoon sun bathed Gold Hill in golden light that softened its rougher edges. Miners were returning from their shifts, and shopkeepers stood in doorways, eyeing the couple with undisguised curiosity. "You're causing quite a stir," Meredith observed, nodding toward a group of women who quickly looked away when caught watching. "Not me," Ethan replied. "You're the first schoolteacher Gold Hills had who didn't flee back east within a month. You were already the subject of speculation before our paths crossed. And now they're wondering if the prim Boston schoolmarm is being courted by the mysterious cowboy." There was a trace of humor in his voice. "Small towns run on gossip and coffee, Miss Owens." Meredith felt her cheeks warm. "Well, they'll be disappointed. I came here to teach, not to feature in local drama. What brought you west, if you don't mind my asking?" His gaze was on the street ahead, but she sensed his attention was fully on her response. "Necessity, initially. My father passed away last year, leaving considerable debts. Teaching positions in Boston are competitive, and those available to women are limited." She sighed, remembering the cold interviews and condescending rejections. When the Gold Hill advertisement arrived at the university employment office, it seemed like divine providence. The salary was generous, the need was clear, and frankly, I was eager for a new horizon. "Your family didn't object." "My mother died when I was young." "I have an aunt in Philadelphia who thought I'd lost my mind, but she's been predicting my doom since I learned to read, so I paid it little mind." Meredith smiled slightly at the memory of Aunt Harriet's dramatic farewell. "What about you, Mr. Vaughn? What brings a man like you to Gold Hill?" Ethan's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his posture. "Business, as I mentioned. Michael Mason at the Rockingham needs hands with certain skills. You're a ranch hand." Meredith couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Despite his worn clothing, there was something in Ethan's manner that spoke of education and careful thought. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I've been many things, Miss Owens. Right now, I'm whatever Mason needs me to be." They had reached Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. Several faces appeared at the windows, not even pretending to be engaged in other activities. "Your audience awaits," Ethan observed dryly. Meredith turned to face him, suddenly reluctant to end their conversation. "Thank you again, Mr. Vaughn, for last night and today." "Ethan," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "If you don't mind." "Ethan," she repeated, finding she liked the sound of it. "Then you must call me Meredith." He nodded once, then surprised her by asking, "Do you ride, Meredith?" "Yes, though not since coming west." "Why?" "Sunday after church. The children will be with their families. The mines run a shorter shift. If you'd like to see more of Montana territory than Gold Hill's Main Street, I could show you." He said it casually, as if offering directions rather than what would certainly be viewed as a social engagement. Meredith was aware of the watching eyes of Mrs. Holloway's certain disapproval, of the fact that she knew almost nothing about this man beyond his timely intervention and quiet courtesy. Prudence dictated a polite refusal. "Yes," she heard herself say instead. "I'd like that very much." The week crawled by with excruciating slowness. Meredith threw herself into her teaching with renewed vigor, determined not to allow her anticipation of Sunday to interfere with her duties. Still, she found her thoughts straying to Ethan Vaughn at odd moments while explaining the Revolutionary War to her older students, while grading arithmetic exercises by lamplight, while listening to Mrs. Holloway's endless stories of her late husband's digestive complaints. Gold Hill watched her with new interest. Women greeted her with knowing smiles at the general store. Men tipped their hats with exaggerated courtesy. Even the children seemed aware of some shift in their teacher's circumstances, giggling behind their slates when she was caught gazing out the window. "It's good to see a young woman with prospects," Mrs. Porter told her over Friday dinner. "Though you might aim higher than a ranch hand with your education." "Mr. Vaughn is merely being kind," Meredith protested, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. There had been something in Ethan's steady gaze that suggested more than casual interest. "Kind men are rare enough out here," Mrs. Holloway pronounced, passing the mashed potatoes. "Though I still say it's improper for a single lady to go riding alone with a gentleman not related by blood or marriage." "We'll be in full view of half the territory," Meredith assured her. "And Mr. Vaughn has shown himself to be honorable." Saturday brought an unexpected visit from Sheriff Thomas, who found Meredith in the school garden, tending to the small plot where her students were growing beans and carrots as a science lesson. "Miss Owens," he said, turning his hat in his hands. "Got a moment?" Meredith brushed soil from her gardening apron. "Of course, Sheriff. Is this about the incident with Mr. Carson's men? Have they been properly disciplined?" Thomas's weathered face creased with discomfort. "They've been dealt with. I'm actually here about this Vaughn fellow." "I understand you're planning an outing with him tomorrow." Meredith stiffened. "News travels quickly in Gold Hill. It's my job to know what happens in my town." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Miss Owens, how much do you actually know about this man?" "I know he intervened when no one else would. I know he's shown me nothing but respect." She studied the sheriff's face. "Is there something specific concerning you, Sheriff Thomas? Just that strangers with fast guns and no background make me uneasy." "Mason over at the Rockingham says Vaughn came highly recommended, but he's vague on details." "Have you asked Mr. Vaughn directly about his past?" The sheriff's expression suggested he hadn't. "Just be careful is all I'm saying. Gold Hill's growing respectable, and we want to keep it that way." After the sheriff left, Meredith found herself troubled by the conversation. It occurred to her that she knew almost nothing about Ethan beyond their brief interactions. Yet something in her trusted him instinctively, the clear gaze that met hers directly, the careful way he maintained appropriate distance, the absence of the swagger that so many Western men affected. Sunday dawned clear and warm. Meredith wore her second-best dress to church, a dark green that brought out the copper highlights in her brown hair, and found herself scanning the congregation for a tall figure. Ethan wasn't there, which shouldn't have disappointed her but did. Mrs. Holloway insisted on an elaborate Sunday dinner, seemingly designed to delay Meredith as long as possible. It was nearly 2 o'clock when Meredith finally changed into her riding clothes, a divided skirt that had scandalized Boston but was practical for Western travel, and made her way to the livery stable, where Ethan had arranged to meet her. He was waiting, looking different in clean clothes, still practical but neater. 2 horses were saddled nearby, including a gentle-looking mare with a white blaze. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said by way of greeting. "I said I would." Meredith approached the mare, letting the horse sniff her hand. "She's lovely. Daisy. Belongs to Mason's daughter, but she's away visiting relatives in Denver. Thought she'd suit you." Ethan helped her mount, his hands respectful but steady on her waist. Once she was settled, he swung easily onto his own horse, a tall chestnut gelding with intelligent eyes. "Where are we going?" Meredith asked as they rode slowly through town, enduring the undisguised stares of Sunday afternoon strollers. "There's a place about 4 miles out. Worth the ride, I think." They left Gold Hill behind, following a trail that wound into the foothills. Aspens shimmered silver-green in the breeze, and wildflowers dotted the meadows with splashes of color. Meredith found herself relaxing as they rode, the rhythm of the horse beneath her and the beauty around her soothing tensions she hadn't realized she was carrying. "Sheriff Thomas came to warn me about you yesterday," she said, after they'd ridden in companionable silence for some time. Ethan glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "Did he now? And what dire warnings did he offer?" "That you're a man of mystery with a fast gun. Apparently that's cause for suspicion in Gold Hill's new era of respectability." She guided Daisy around a rocky patch. "I realized he has a point in a way." "I know almost nothing about you." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the trail ahead. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," she thought. "Where you're from. Why you carry a gun like it's part of you. Why your eyes look like they've seen too much." Instead, she asked, "Where did you learn to ride? You sit a horse like you were born to it." A small smile touched his mouth. "Virginia originally. My father raised horses before the war. After that, well, a man picks up skills where he can." "The war changed many things," Meredith said softly, thinking of her own father who had returned from the conflict a different man than the one who had marched away. "Some for the better eventually," Ethan agreed. "Without it, I might never have come west. And what brought you this far west?" "Virginia to Montana is quite a journey." Ethan's expression grew more distant. "Work initially. I rode with a cattle outfit up from Texas after the war, then scouted for the Army for a spell, did some other jobs that needed doing." He looked at her directly. "Some of it wasn't the kind of work a lady from Boston would approve of, I expect." "You might be surprised what a lady from Boston can understand," Meredith said. "I've learned that people are rarely as simple as they first appear." The trail widened into a small plateau, and Ethan reined his horse to a stop. "We're here," Meredith gasped softly. Before them, the land fell away into a sweeping vista of Montana wilderness, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, a ribbon of river winding through the valley below, and the endless sky arching overhead, so vast it made her feel tiny and immense all at once. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Worth the ride." Ethan dismounted and approached to help her down. "Worth every moment." She allowed him to lift her from the saddle, acutely aware of his strength as her feet touched the ground. "How did you find this place? Scouting has its advantages." He tied the horses to a nearby aspen, then spread a small blanket on a flat rock overlooking the view. From his saddlebags, he produced a canteen and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "It's not much, some biscuits, cheese, dried apple. Thought you might be hungry after that ride." Meredith was touched by the thoughtfulness. They sat side by side on the blanket, sharing the simple meal while watching golden eagles soar on the thermals rising from the valley. The vastness before them made conversation feel unnecessary, and they ate in comfortable silence for a time. "You never answered the sheriff's implicit question," Meredith said eventually. "What brought you specifically to Gold Hill? The Rocking M isn't the only ranch looking for hands." Ethan took a drink from the canteen before answering. "Michael Mason and I served together briefly during the war. When he wrote that he needed someone he could trust, I came." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. "There's trouble brewing around Gold Hill, Meredith. Mason's been losing cattle. Small numbers, nothing obvious but consistent, and he's not the only one. Rustlers, maybe. But there's more to it." Ethan's eyes scanned the valley below. "Carson's been buying up land, including parcels that control water access. Ranchers who won't sell find themselves with problems, missing cattle, damaged fences, frightened hands." Meredith thought of Carson's thinly veiled warning in the schoolhouse. "You think he's behind it. I think Carson wants something, and he's not particular about how he gets it." Ethan turned to look at her directly. "Which is why you should be careful. Men like that don't like anyone interfering with their plans, even schoolteachers." "I'm hardly interfering with anything," Meredith protested. "You stood up to him. That's enough for some men to take notice." His expression softened slightly. "And you're noticeable, Meredith Owens." The air between them changed, charged suddenly with something more than the shared confidences. Meredith was acutely aware of his proximity, of the breadth of his shoulders, of the way the sunlight caught in his eyes. "Is that why you invited me riding? To warn me about Carson?" She hadn't meant it to sound like an accusation, but something in her wanted to know if his interest was purely protective. "No." The single word was soft but definite. "I invited you because I wanted to spend time with you. The warning is incidental." "Oh." Meredith felt warmth rising to her cheeks. "I see." Ethan shifted slightly, giving her space. "I don't want to presume, Meredith. You're educated, refined. I'm just a man who stopped to help when others wouldn't," she interrupted. "That tells me more about your character than any formal education could." Something vulnerable flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his intent, and when she didn't pull away, he gently tucked a strand of hair that had escaped her pins behind her ear. "We should head back soon," he said, his voice lower, "before Mrs. Holloway sends a search party." The ride back to Gold Hill was quieter, filled with glances and small smiles rather than conversation. Something had shifted between them, a tentative recognition of mutual interest that made Meredith's heart beat faster whenever their eyes met. As they approached town, Ethan drew his horse alongside hers. "Would you allow me to call on you properly, perhaps Wednesday evening?" "Yes," Meredith replied, too quickly for propriety but too honestly to regret it. "I'd like that very much." Gold Hill watched them return with undisguised interest. Meredith was certain that by supper, every resident would have formed an opinion on her afternoon ride with the mysterious Mr. Vaughn. For once, she found she didn't care what they thought. Monday brought rain and restless students. Meredith struggled to keep their attention on geography when thunderclaps periodically shook the schoolhouse windows. Her own thoughts weren't much more disciplined, straying repeatedly to the memory of Ethan's hand, gently tucking her hair behind her ear, the intensity in his eyes when he'd spoken of trouble brewing. She was dismissing the children early due to the worsening storm when Sheriff Thomas appeared in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat. He waited until the last student had scampered away before approaching her desk. "Miss Owens, hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Sheriff." "Is something wrong?" Thomas removed his hat, looking uncomfortable. "There was some trouble at the Broken Spur last night. Seems your friend Vaughn got into an altercation with Brett Sawyer, one of the men who accosted you." Meredith's stomach tightened. "What happened?" Words were exchanged. "Punches thrown. Sawyer got the worst of it, broken nose, couple of teeth loose." The sheriff twisted his hat in his hands. "Witnesses say Sawyer started it, making remarks about you that a gentleman wouldn't repeat. Vaughn took exception." "Is Mr. Vaughn all right?" "Cut on his cheek, bruised knuckles. Nothing serious." Thomas frowned. "Miss Owens, I need to be plain. Gold Hill's trying to grow respectable. Saloon brawls over a lady's honor might seem romantic in dime novels, but they set us back. If you've encouraged this man's attentions, Sheriff Thomas," Meredith interrupted, her voice cooling considerably. "I have done nothing to encourage violence of any kind. If Mr. Vaughn defended my reputation against slander, that was his choice. And if you're suggesting that I somehow invited either the original attack or this subsequent incident, I find that deeply offensive." Thomas had the grace to look abashed. "That's not what I meant exactly. Just that Vaughn's stirring things up since he arrived, and you seem to be at the center of it. Perhaps you should direct your concerns to men who assault women and slander their reputations, rather than to those who intervene." Meredith gathered her books with pointed finality. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to secure the schoolhouse before this storm worsens." The sheriff left, but his words lingered. Meredith had no illusions about the complexities of frontier life, but it troubled her deeply that Thomas seemed more concerned with a saloon fight than with the attack that had precipitated it. It spoke to undercurrents in Gold Hill that she was only beginning to perceive. By Wednesday, the rain had passed, leaving the streets of Gold Hill muddy but the air clean and fresh. Meredith found concentration nearly impossible as the school day drew to a close. She had changed her dress 3 times that morning before settling on a blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and had taken extra care with her hair, pinning it in a style that was neat but softer than her usual severe arrangement. Mrs. Holloway had insisted that Ethan's visit take place in the boarding-house parlor, with the door left pointedly ajar and with frequent interruptions to offer tea or inquire about non-existent drafts. Despite these impediments, Meredith found the evening magical. Ethan arrived precisely at 7, bearing a small posy of wildflowers that he presented with a quiet "These reminded me of you." The cut on his cheek was healing, a thin red line that somehow added to rather than detracted from his appearance. They spoke of inconsequential things, at first the weather, the progress of her students, a book of poetry he had noticed on the parlor table. Gradually, as Mrs. Holloway's interventions grew less frequent, their conversation deepened. "I wanted to apologize," Ethan said during a rare moment of privacy, "for the incident at the saloon. It wasn't my intention to cause talk that might embarrass you." "The sheriff seemed more concerned than I am," Meredith replied, "though I wouldn't want you getting hurt on my account. It wasn't much of a fight. Sawyer's all talk when he's not cornering schoolteachers in alleys." Ethan's expression darkened briefly. "Though I suspect he had encouragement to start trouble." "From Carson," Ethan nodded slightly. "Mason's been receiving pressure to sell some of his land, specifically the northeast section that controls access to Cottonwood Creek. It's good water, doesn't dry up in summer. And your arrival has something to do with this pressure." A small smile. Mason thought having someone around who wasn't easily intimidated might help. Carson's men have been testing boundaries, seeing how far they can push. "And how far is that?" Meredith asked quietly. Ethan met her eyes directly. "Not as far as they think." There was something in his tone that sent a shiver through her, not fear, exactly, but recognition of contained power. Ethan Vaughn was a gentle man. She was increasingly certain, but not a weak one. "Enough about Carson," he said, his expression softening. "Tell me about Boston." "What do you miss most?" "Libraries," she answered immediately. "Bookshops where one can browse for hours. Concerts," she smiled, remembering. "And good tea. Mrs. Holloway's brew could strip paint." Ethan laughed, a warm sound that made something flutter in Meredith's chest. "I've never been to Boston. Farthest east I've been since the war was St. Louis. You should see it someday. The Common in spring, the harbor at sunset." She trailed off, suddenly wistful. "You regret coming west?" he asked perceptively. Meredith considered the question seriously. "No. I miss certain comforts and refinements, but there's something vital about life here. In Boston, everything was established, predictable. Here, it feels as though one's actions matter more directly." "They do," Ethan agreed. "For better or worse, frontier towns are shaped by the people who inhabit them, not by centuries of tradition." "Is that why you've stayed in the West? The freedom to shape your own path?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Partly. And partly because the West is more forgiving of a man's past. It asks what you can do, not where you came from or what name your father bore." Before Meredith could pursue this revealing statement, Mrs. Holloway bustled in with a fresh pot of her terrible tea and pointed observations about the lateness of the hour. Ethan took the hint gracefully, rising to leave. At the door, away from Mrs. Holloway's watchful eye, he took Meredith's hand briefly in his. "May I see you again? Perhaps Sunday after church?" "Yes," she said simply, treasuring the warmth of his touch. In the days that followed, Gold Hill buzzed with speculation about the schoolteacher and the mysterious cowboy. Some approved, seeing romance as a civilizing influence. Others, particularly those connected to Carson's mining interests, were less enthusiastic. Meredith found herself receiving cooler greetings from certain quarters, while others went out of their way to show support. "Don't you mind what anyone says," Mrs. Porter told her over breakfast. "Half this town married after knowing their spouse less time than you've known Mr. Vaughn. At least he's sober and employed, which is more than some can claim." On Friday afternoon, as Meredith was closing up the schoolhouse, a sleek carriage pulled up outside. Frederick Carson himself descended, immaculately dressed as always. "Miss Owens," he greeted her with a tight smile. "Might I have a word?" Something in his manner put her immediately on guard. "Of course, Mr. Carson, though I'm afraid I can't offer you tea. I was just leaving." "This won't take long." Carson followed her inside, removing his hat, but retaining his gloves, a small detail that struck Meredith as oddly telling. He surveyed the schoolroom with the same evaluating gaze he'd shown before. "I understand you've become acquainted with a man working for Michael Mason." Meredith continued gathering her things, determined not to show discomfort. "Mr. Vaughn has been kind enough to escort me on several occasions, yes. I wonder if you know exactly what kind of man you're associating with." Carson's voice was smooth, almost concerned. "Ethan Vaughn has quite a history, from what I've been able to learn. Rode with some questionable outfits after the war. Was involved in several violent incidents in Colorado territory. Not the sort of man a respectable teacher should be seen with." Meredith straightened, meeting Carson's gaze directly. "Mr. Carson, while I appreciate your concern, my personal associations are my own affair." "Are they?" Carson moved closer, his manner shifting subtly. Gold Hill hired you to educate our children, to be an example of refinement and propriety. The school board might take a different view if they felt their teacher was compromising those standards. The threat was thinly veiled. Meredith felt a flicker of fear but refused to show it. Are you suggesting my position might be at risk because I've allowed a gentleman to escort me home? That seems rather extreme. I'm merely pointing out that reputations are fragile things on the frontier, especially for a woman alone. Carson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Vaughn will move on eventually. Men like him always do. But you've built something valuable here, Miss Owens. Would be a shame to see it damaged over a temporary infatuation. Anger flared hot in Meredith's chest. Mr. Carson, I don't know what your real objection to Mr. Vaughn is, but I suspect it has little to do with my reputation and more to do with whatever conflict exists between you and the Rockingham Ranch. She gathered her books, signaling the conversation's end. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have preparations for Monday's lessons. Carson's expression hardened momentarily before he regained his smooth facade. Of course, I've taken enough of your time. At the door, he paused. Just remember, Miss Owens, in places like Gold Hill, choosing sides can have consequences. After he left, Meredith sat at her desk, hands trembling slightly. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Carson's power in Gold Hill was considerable. He owned the mine, held interests in several businesses, and as Mrs. Porter had observed, effectively controlled the town council. If he decided to make trouble for her, he could. Yet something in her rebelled at the thought of allowing intimidation to dictate her actions. If there was conflict between Carson and the Rockingham, and if Ethan was somehow central to it, she wanted to understand why. More importantly, she wanted to make her own judgments, not have them dictated by a man whose concern for her welfare rang decidedly false. Sunday couldn't come quickly enough. Meredith sat through the church service, barely hearing Reverend Phillips's sermon on temperance. Her attention focused on the tall figure who had slipped quietly into the back pew shortly after the service began. It was the first time she'd seen Ethan in church, and something about his presence there, respectful but slightly apart from the congregation, touched her deeply. Afterward, navigating the gauntlet of after-church socializing with as much grace as she could muster, Meredith finally made her way to where Ethan waited at the edge of the churchyard. He looked different in his Sunday clothes, still simple, but clean and pressed, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaven. "You came," she said, unable to hide her pleasure. Seemed appropriate. His smile was warm but slightly self-conscious. "Though I think Reverend Phillips might have tailored his sermon on the evils of saloon fighting with me in mind." Meredith laughed. "At least he didn't call you out by name. Last month he lectured poor Mr. Willis about fishing on Sundays while staring directly at him the entire time." They walked slowly toward the boarding house, conscious of the eyes following them, but finding it increasingly easy to ignore the attention. "I had a visit from Frederick Carson yesterday," Meredith said when they were beyond immediate earshot of the congregation. "He seems quite concerned about my association with you." Ethan's expression grew more serious. "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly. Just insinuated that my position might be at risk if I continue to, how did he put it, compromise standards of propriety." A muscle tightened in Ethan's jaw. "Carson doesn't like what he can't control, and he especially doesn't like that Mason brought me in." "Why? What does he think you'll do?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. "Stop him if necessary. Carson's been systematically cutting off water access to ranches that won't sell to him. He's hired men to intimidate smaller ranchers, run off stock, damage property. Nothing that can be proven definitively, but a clear pattern. He glanced at her. Mason's the last major holdout. His water rights are crucial to Carson's plans for expanding his mining operation. And your presence complicates things, Meredith guessed. I have certain skills that make intimidation tactics less effective. There was no boasting in his tone, just statement of fact. Carson prefers working from the shadows, letting his hired men do the dirty work. Having someone who can push back changes his calculations. They had reached the boarding house. Mrs. Holloway was mercifully absent, having stayed behind at church to discuss the upcoming ladies' auxiliary meeting. "Ethan," Meredith said quietly, "Carson mentioned your past. He said you were involved in violent incidents in Colorado territory, that you rode with questionable outfits after the war." Ethan's expression closed slightly. "Did he now?" "I'm not asking for an accounting," she added quickly. "We all have parts of our past that are complicated. I want to understand what I'm facing, what we're facing." He studied her for a long moment. "I've done things I'm not proud of, Meredith. After the war I was lost, I suppose. Took jobs I shouldn't have. Rode with men whose moral compass wasn't always true." His voice was low, steady. "I never broke the law as I understood it, but I've been on the edges often enough. I've used my gun when necessary, though never sought opportunities to do so." Meredith absorbed this, finding it aligned with her intuitive sense of him, a man who had seen darkness but wasn't defined by it. "Thank you for telling me the truth. You deserve nothing less." His eyes met hers directly. "If my presence in your life is going to cause you difficulty, I'll understand if you'd prefer to end our association." "No," she said firmly. "I won't be intimidated by Carson or anyone else. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I find I've grown rather fond of your company, Mr. Vaughn." Something in Ethan's face softened, and he reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "Meredith, I should tell you," the sound of approaching voices interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Mrs. Holloway and several other church ladies were coming up the street, their expressions shifting from animated conversation to keen interest at the sight of Meredith and Ethan standing close together. Ethan released Meredith's hand but didn't step away. "I'll call on you Wednesday," he said quietly. "If that's acceptable." "It is," she replied, already looking forward to it. The following week brought escalating tensions in Gold Hill. On Tuesday, one of Carson's foremen was found badly beaten on the trail between town and the mine. He claimed he'd been set upon by masked men, but suspicion immediately fell on the Rockingham hands. Sheriff Thomas questioned several ranch hands, including Ethan, but could establish nothing concrete. Wednesday evening, when Ethan called on Meredith, he arrived with a darkening bruise on his temple. "What happened?" she asked immediately, her hand reaching toward his face before she caught herself. "Misunderstanding with some of Carson's men," he said dismissively. "Nothing serious, Mrs." Holloway hovered more than usual that evening, her disapproval evident in pointed sighs and frequent reminders about propriety. When she finally left them alone for a few minutes, Ethan leaned forward, speaking quietly. "Things are coming to a head, Meredith. Carson's getting desperate. 2 nights ago, someone cut fences on the Rockingham North pasture. Last night, shots were fired at one of Mason's hands riding back from town. That's terrible. Has Sheriff Thomas done anything?" "Thomas is in Carson's pocket, or afraid of him at the very least. He makes the right noises but takes no real action." Ethan's expression was grim. "Mason's called in some of his neighbors. There's going to be a meeting tomorrow night at the ranch to decide how to respond." Meredith felt cold apprehension. "You don't think it will come to violence?" "I think it already has, and the question is whether it will escalate further." Ethan took her hand, his touch gentle despite the gravity of his words. "Meredith, I want you to be careful. Carson knows that you matter to me. He might see that as leverage." The simple statement, "you matter to me," sent warmth through her despite the warning. "What can I do?" "Stay alert. Don't go anywhere alone if you can help it. And if anyone associated with Carson approaches you, be cautious." His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. "I wouldn't forgive myself if you were hurt because of me." "This isn't because of you," Meredith said firmly. "It's because of Carson's greed and willingness to use intimidation to get what he wants. Don't take that responsibility on yourself." Ethan looked at her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. "You're quite remarkable, Meredith Owens. Do you know that?" Before she could respond, Mrs. Holloway returned with another pot of her dreadful tea and pointed comments about the lateness of the hour. Ethan took his leave soon after, but not before pressing Meredith's hand meaningfully and promising to send word after the ranchers' meeting. Thursday passed in a haze of anxiety for Meredith. She found herself watching the schoolhouse door, half expecting Carson or his men to appear with more threats. When school ended, she was surprised and relieved to find Michael Mason himself waiting outside, his teenage daughter Lily beside him. "Miss Owens," Mason greeted her, tipping his hat. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. Lily's been wanting to meet the teacher Ethan speaks so highly of, and I thought you might appreciate some company on your walk home." Lily, a pretty girl of about 15 with her father's direct gaze, smiled shyly. "Mr. Vaughn said you came from Boston. Is it true they have libraries bigger than our whole town?" Meredith found herself warming to the girl immediately. "Some of them, yes. The Boston Athenaeum has over 100,000 volumes. 100,000 books," Lily breathed, clearly trying to imagine such riches. "Pa says I read too much as it is, but I can't help it." "No such thing as reading too much," Mason said good-naturedly. "Just sometimes there's work needs doing first." As they walked, Mason explained that he'd come to town for supplies and thought to check on Meredith after Ethan had expressed concern. "He's tied up with some ranch business, or he'd have come himself," Mason added, his tone casual but his eyes watchful of their surroundings. Meredith understood then that this was no casual social call. Mason was ensuring her safety. "Mr. Vaughn mentioned there's been some trouble at your ranch," she said carefully, mindful of Lily's presence. "Bit of fence cutting, some missing cattle, nothing we can't handle." Mason's tone was light, but there was steel beneath it. "We've got good neighbors who understand that what happens to one ranch today might happen to theirs tomorrow." At the boarding house, Lily impulsively invited Meredith to visit the Rockingham. "We've got a piano no one plays properly since Ma died, and Pa says you're musical." "Ethan might have mentioned it," Mason admitted with a smile. "We'd be honored to have you visit, Miss Owens, perhaps this weekend if circumstances allow." Meredith understood the caveat. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Mason. Please give Mr. Vaughn my regards when you see him." That night, Meredith found sleep elusive, her mind racing with worry about the ranchers' meeting and what might come of it. Outside, a storm was gathering, distant thunder rolling across the hills surrounding Gold Hill. She had just drifted into an uneasy sleep when a sharp rap at her bedroom window jolted her awake. For a terrifying moment, she thought Carson's men had come for her. Then she heard a familiar voice, low and urgent. "Meredith, it's Ethan." She hurried to the window, wrapping her robe tightly around her nightdress. Ethan stood in the rain, his hat doing little to keep him dry. "What's happened?" she whispered, pushing the window open. "Carson's men hit the Thompson place tonight, burned a barn, shot up the house. Thompson's youngest boy was grazed by a bullet." Ethan's face was grim in the dim light. "Mason sent me to warn you. We think Carson might escalate further, try to make examples of people associated with the ranchers. Come around to the back door, Meredith said immediately. You're soaked through. Minutes later, she led him into the darkened kitchen, grateful that Mrs. Holloway was a sound sleeper. Ethan stood dripping on the floor, his expression a mixture of concern and apology. I shouldn't be here. If anyone saw me. He left the implications unspoken. I'm not concerned about my reputation at the moment, Meredith said firmly, handing him a towel. Is the Thompson boy all right? He will be. Doc Wilson's with him now. Ethan dried his face and hair. The ranchers are gathering at Mason's tomorrow. Most have sent their families to stay with relatives in safer areas. Mason wanted me to ask if you'd consider coming to the ranch, at least until this is resolved. Lily would welcome the company, and you'd be safer there than here in town. The idea was shocking to leave her post, to stay at her ranch with a man she was increasingly drawn to, yet the gravity of Ethan's expression told her this was no casual invitation. What about my students? The school? Mason's sending word to the town council tomorrow recommending school be suspended until the situation is resolved. Most of the children are from ranching families anyway, and their parents are already keeping them home. Meredith hesitated, torn between duty and the very real fear in Ethan's eyes. Carson wouldn't actually harm a schoolteacher, surely. That would turn the whole town against him. A month ago, I would have agreed. Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping. But he's growing desperate. The territorial governors sent word he's investigating reports of land intimidation. Carson needs to secure water rights quickly or risk losing everything. He touched her cheek gently. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you, Meredith. The tenderness in his voice decided her. All right. I'll come. When? Tomorrow afternoon. I'll bring a wagon. Relief washed over his face. Thank you. The intimacy of the moment, standing close in the darkened kitchen, the rain drumming on the roof, his hand warm against her face, made Meredith acutely conscious of propriety's fragile boundaries. Yet she couldn't bring herself to step away. Ethan, she whispered, be careful. Whatever happens tomorrow. He nodded once, understanding her unspoken concern. Then, with a restraint that spoke volumes about his character, he stepped back, breaking the charged moment between them. I should go before Mrs. Holloway wakes and finds me compromising your reputation beyond repair. My reputation seems increasingly irrelevant compared to people's safety, Meredith said with surprising firmness. Ethan smiled slightly. Nevertheless, I'll see you tomorrow. After he left, slipping back into the rainy night, Meredith stood for a long time in the kitchen, her heart racing with equal parts fear and anticipation. Something was changing in Gold Hill, and in her own life, a convergence of tension and possibility that both terrified and exhilarated her. Morning brought chaos to Gold Hill. News of the attack on the Thompson ranch had spread through town, polarizing opinion along predictable lines. Ranching families and their allies denounced it as the latest in Carson's campaign of intimidation. Those dependent on the mine for their livelihood defended Carson, insisting he couldn't possibly be involved in such violence. Sheriff Thomas made a show of investigating, but his half-hearted questioning of Carson's foreman fooled no one. By noon, the town council had indeed voted to suspend school until order is restored, effectively adopting a neutral stance that satisfied neither side. Meredith spent the morning packing a small valise and explaining to an apoplectic Mrs. Holloway that she would be staying at the Rockingham Ranch at the invitation of Mr. Mason and his daughter. It's completely improper, Mrs. Holloway declared. A single woman staying at her ranch with men. What will people say? They'll say I'm being sensible by removing myself from potential danger, Meredith replied calmly. Lily Mason needs a female companion while these troubles persist, and I need somewhere safe to stay. It's a practical arrangement." Mrs. Holloway was unconvinced. "It's that Vaughn fellow's influence. He's turned your head with his mysterious ways and dramatic rescues." There was enough truth in this that Meredith felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Vaughn works for Mr. Mason. His presence at the ranch is incidental to my decision." This transparent falsehood didn't even convince Meredith herself, let alone Mrs. Holloway, who snorted in disbelief. "Well, I can't stop you. You're a grown woman, though sometimes I wonder if you remember that fact. But don't expect me to defend your reputation when the gossips start wagging their tongues." "I would never ask that of you, Mrs. Holloway," Meredith said, suppressing a smile. "Ethan arrived with the wagon shortly after noon." He looked tired but alert, his eyes scanning the street constantly as he helped load Meredith's valise and a small trunk of books. "Any trouble?" he asked quietly as they pulled away from the boarding house. "Just Mrs. Holloway's dire predictions about my ruined reputation," Meredith replied, trying for lightness despite her nerves. "How are things at the ranch?" "Tense. Ranchers have been arriving all morning. Most have brought hands with them, good men, but this isn't what they signed on for." Ethan guided the horses carefully through town, nodding acknowledgement to those who greeted them but not slowing. "Mason's hoping a show of unity will make Carson reconsider his tactics. And if it doesn't," Ethan's expression hardened, "then we'll do what needs doing to protect what's ours." The "we" wasn't lost on Meredith. Whatever had brought Ethan to the Rocking M, he had clearly committed himself to the ranch's cause. It made her wonder what would happen when the conflict was resolved, one way or another. Would he move on, as Carson had predicted? The thought brought an unexpected ache. They were nearing the edge of town when a sleek carriage pulled out from a side street, blocking their path. Frederick Carson himself sat in the driver's seat, looking immaculate despite the dust and heat. "Miss Owens," he called, his voice carrying the same false concern she remembered from the schoolhouse. "I heard school was suspended. Terrible business, these ranch troubles. Are you leaving town?" Ethan had tensed beside her, his hand moving subtly toward his gun. Meredith placed her hand on his arm, a silent request for restraint. "Just temporarily, Mr. Carson," she replied with forced politeness. "Mr. Mason's daughter has kindly invited me to stay at the ranch until matters settle." Carson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I see. Well, I'd be remiss not to point out that the Rocking M might not be the safest place in the current climate. Ranchers who resist progress often find themselves facing difficulties." "Is that a threat, Carson?" Ethan's voice was quiet but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "Merely an observation, Mr. Vaughn." Carson's gaze shifted to Ethan, the pretense of cordiality dropping away. "We all make choices in life. Some lead to prosperity, others to, well, less favorable outcomes." "We'd appreciate you moving your carriage," Meredith said, her own voice steadier than she felt. "We have a long ride ahead." Carson studied her for a moment longer, then inclined his head slightly. "Of course. Safe travels, Miss Owens. Do remember what I said about choosing sides." He flicked the reins, guiding his carriage out of their path. As they continued out of town, Meredith released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That man terrifies me," she admitted quietly. "He should," Ethan replied, his gaze following Carson's carriage until it disappeared. "Men like that, men who believe their ambition justifies any action, are always dangerous." The Rocking M Ranch sprawled across a verdant valley 30 miles from Gold Hill. Its main house, a substantial 2-story structure built of local timber and stone. As they approached, Meredith could see activity everywhere, men moving purposefully between barns and corrals, horses being saddled, wagons being unloaded. Lily Mason came running out to greet them, her face lighting up at the sight of Meredith. "You came. Pa wasn't sure you would, what with Mrs. Holloway being such a stickler for propriety." Meredith laughed, finding the girl's enthusiasm infectious despite the circumstances. "Mrs. Holloway had plenty to say on the matter, but here I am nonetheless." Michael Mason appeared on the porch, tall and weathered like most ranchers, but with an air of quiet authority that reminded Meredith somewhat of Ethan. He greeted her warmly, apologizing for the circumstances of her visit. "Lily's been desperate for female company since her mother passed," he explained as he showed Meredith to a comfortable bedroom on the second floor. "Having you here is a blessing, regardless of the troubles that brought you." "I'm happy to help," Meredith said sincerely, touched by the care evident in the room's preparation: fresh flowers on the dresser, clean linens on the bed, curtains recently washed and pressed. "We're having a meeting this evening," Mason continued. "Ranchers from all over the county. It might get heated. Lily will show you to the library if you'd prefer to avoid it." "Actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to attend," Meredith said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I've been affected by Carson's actions too, and I'd like to understand what we're facing." Mason studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Ethan said you had spirit. Guess he wasn't exaggerating. You're welcome to join us, Miss Owens." The meeting began after supper, the ranch house dining room transformed into an impromptu council chamber. 15 ranchers gathered around the long table, with another dozen hands standing against the walls. Ethan took a position behind Mason's chair, his presence quiet but commanding. Meredith sat beside Lily at the far end of the table, conscious of being the only woman present besides Mason's daughter. Several of the ranchers nodded respectfully to her, while others looked puzzled or mildly disapproving of her presence. Mason called the meeting to order without ceremony. "We all know why we're here. Carson's moved from threats to actual violence. Thompson's boy could have been killed." Jim Thompson, a weathered man with grief and anger etched into his face, spoke up. "Doc Wilson says Caleb will recover, but it was close. Bullet grazed his temple while he was sleeping, if it had been an inch to the right." He trailed off, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "We've tried working through proper channels," another rancher said. "Sheriff won't help. Territorial authorities move too slow. Meanwhile, Carson's men get bolder every day." "What exactly does Carson want?" Meredith asked during a pause in the discussion. All eyes turned to her, some surprised at her intervention. Mason answered after a moment. "Control of the watershed. Cottonwood Creek and its tributaries water most of our ranges. Carson needs that water for his expanded mining operations and for the smelter he's planning to build." "A smelter would poison the water for everyone downstream," one of the older ranchers added. "End of ranching in this valley, pure and simple." "So this isn't just about property rights," Meredith said slowly. "It's about the future of the entire region." "That's the heart of it," Mason agreed. "Carson sees one future for Gold Hill, a mining town under his control. We see another ranches, farms, a balanced community." The discussion grew more heated as various proposals were considered and rejected. Some advocated going to the territorial capital to demand intervention. Others suggested more direct action against Carson's operations. Throughout, Ethan remained silent, his expression giving little away. Only when Thompson suggested ambushing Carson's men did he speak up. "We start shooting, we become what Carson claims we are: outlaws, impediments to progress." His voice was quiet but carried across the now silent room. "That's exactly what he wants. Gives him justification for whatever comes next." "So what do you suggest, Vaughn?" Thompson demanded. Wait for them to pick us off one by one. I suggest we concentrate our strength. Move women, children, and essential hands to the largest ranches places like the Rocking M that can be defended if necessary. Keep men patrolling in groups, never alone. Document everything, every cut fence, every missing cow, every threatening encounter. And then, someone asked. Then we present that evidence to Judge Harmon when he arrives next week for circuit court. He's known to be independent of mining interests, with connections to the governor. Ethan's gaze moved around the room. Carson's powerful in Gold Hill, but he's not above territorial law. If we can prove systematic intimidation, the court can act. There was silence as the ranchers considered this. Mason was the first to speak. Vaughn's right. We need to be smarter than Carson, not just angrier, all in favor of his approach. Hands rose around the table, some quickly, others with reluctance. In the end, all but Thompson agreed to the plan. "A week," Thompson said grimly. "I'll give it a week, but if that judge doesn't deliver justice, I'll find it my own way." As the meeting broke up, Meredith found herself watching Ethan with new appreciation. His strategy had been logical, measured the voice of reason amid emotional responses. Yet she sensed that his restraint wasn't born of timidity, but of hard-won wisdom. Later, as lanterns were being extinguished and the ranch settling for the night, Meredith found Ethan on the porch, staring out at the distant hills where heat lightning flickered silently. "That was well handled," she said, moving to stand beside him at the railing. "You gave them a way forward that doesn't involve bloodshed." "For now," Ethan replied, his profile illuminated by the intermittent flashes. "Thompson's not wrong to be skeptical. The law isn't always swift or just especially out here. But violence would play into Carson's hands." "Yes." He turned to look at her, his expression softening. "You should be resting. It's been a long day." "My mind is too full for sleep," Meredith admitted. "Besides, it's beautiful out here. I've never seen so many stars." They stood in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the ranch, distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of a horse, the creak of windmills creating a peaceful backdrop despite the tensions of the day. "Mason seems like a good man," Meredith said eventually. "You've known him long, since the war, though we've only kept irregular contact over the years." Ethan's voice was reflective. "When he wrote asking for help, I was in Wyoming, working a cattle drive that had turned sour. His letter came at the right time. And now you're caught in the middle of another conflict. Some men find trouble wherever they go," Ethan acknowledged with a slight smile. "Or maybe trouble finds them." "Is that what you believe? That trouble is inevitable?" He considered her question seriously. "I used to. After the war, it seemed like peace was just a brief interval between conflicts. But lately—" He paused, his eyes finding hers in the darkness. "Lately, I've been thinking there might be another way to live." The implication in his words, the possibility they hinted at, made Meredith's heart beat faster. "What kind of way?" Ethan turned to face her fully, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling night air. "A settled one. In one place, with purpose beyond just surviving until the next day." His voice dropped lower. "With someone worth staying for." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Meredith knew they were approaching a threshold that whatever happened next would change things between them irrevocably. "Meredith," Ethan began, his hand moving to gently touch her face. "I know this isn't the right time with everything that's happening. But I need you to know that the sound of rapid hoofbeats approaching the ranch cut him off. They both turned toward the noise, the moment broken. A rider was coming fast, his horse lathered despite the night's coolness. Mason appeared in the doorway behind them, rifle in hand. "Trouble?" he asked Ethan. "Looks like one of the Dawson boys," Ethan replied, already moving toward the yard to intercept the rider. It was indeed young Sam Dawson, barely 18 and white-faced with urgency. "Fire at our place," he gasped as he dismounted. "Pa sent me for help." Carson's men, a dozen of them, torching the barns. The ranch exploded into activity. Men who had been preparing for sleep now grabbed weapons and saddled horses. Mason issued crisp orders organizing the response. Ethan turned to Meredith, conflict evident in his face. "I have to go." "I know," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear clutching at her heart. "Be careful." He hesitated for only a moment before pulling her into a swift, fierce embrace. "Stay close to the house. Mason's leaving 6 men to guard the place." Then he was gone, mounting his chestnut gelding and riding out with the others, a cloud of dust swallowing them in the darkness. Meredith stood watching long after they'd disappeared, her arms wrapped around herself, preservation against the night's sudden chill and the cold dread that had settled in her stomach. "They'll be all right," Lily said beside her, her young face solemn in the lamplight spilling from the house. "Pa knows what he's doing, and so does Mr. Vaughn." "Yes," Meredith agreed, putting an arm around the girl's shoulders. "Yes, I'm sure they do." But as she followed Lily back into the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that events were accelerating toward a conclusion none of them could fully control. The night passed with excruciating slowness. Meredith tried to distract Lily with books and conversation, but both of them found their attention constantly drawn to the windows, searching the darkness for returning riders. The hands left to guard the ranch maintained a vigilant perimeter, their occasional movements the only break in the tense stillness. It was nearly dawn when they heard horses approaching. Meredith and Lily rushed to the porch, straining to see in the gray pre-dawn light. Relief flooded through Meredith as she recognized Mason's tall figure at the head of the returning party, followed closely by Ethan. The men looked exhausted, streaked with soot and grim-faced. As they dismounted, Meredith could see that 3 riders were supported by companions, obviously injured. "Pa!" Lily cried, running to her father. "What happened?" Mason embraced his daughter briefly. "We got there in time to save the house, but the barns are gone. Dawson lost most of his winter hay and 3 prized bulls." He looked over at Meredith. "We could use some help with the wounded." "Nothing too serious burns. A few cuts, but they need tending." "Of course," Meredith said immediately, glad to have something useful to do. As she helped organize bandages and water in the ranch kitchen, she caught glimpses of Ethan conferring with Mason and several other ranchers. His face was set in hard lines she hadn't seen before, his manner urgent. It was nearly an hour before he sought her out, finding her applying salve to a young ranch hand's burned forearm. He waited patiently until she had finished before drawing her aside. "Carson's men didn't just set fires," he said without preamble, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "They left a message, said the next attack would be here at the Rockingham." Fear clutched at Meredith's heart. When? They didn't specify, but they're escalating quickly now. Ethan ran a hand through his dust-streaked hair. "Mason's sending Lily to his sister's place in Bozeman. I think you should go with her. And leave all of you here to face whatever comes next." Meredith shook her head firmly. "No, I won't run away." Frustration and concern warred in Ethan's expression. "This isn't your fight, Meredith. It became my fight when Carson threatened my position for associating with you, when his men attacked me in that alley." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm staying." For a moment, she thought he would argue further. Instead, a different emotion crossed his face, admiration, perhaps, or something deeper. "You are the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said softly, the beginnings of a smile touching his mouth despite the gravity of the situation. "So I've been told," Meredith replied, usually not as a compliment. "It wasn't meant as one," Ethan said, though his eyes suggested otherwise. "If you're staying, then we need to make sure you're safe. No wandering off, no heroics. The house will be the most defensible position if—" When Carson makes his move, Mason approached before Meredith could respond. "Lily's refusing to go to Bozeman," he said with a mixture of exasperation and pride. "Says she won't leave her home when it's threatened. Wonder where she gets such notions." He glanced meaningfully at Meredith. "Perhaps we're both influenced by the courage we see around us," Meredith suggested. Mason's weathered face softened slightly. "Well, since neither of you will see sense, we'll need to prepare accordingly. Vaughn, what do you suggest?" The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. The ranchers who had gathered for the meeting now organized themselves into a defensive force. Hay bales were positioned as barricades around the main house and essential outbuildings. Rifles and ammunition were distributed. Watches were organized in shifts, with riders patrolling the boundaries of Mason's property. Through it all, Ethan was a constant presence, directing, planning, his experience in such matters evident in the confidence with which others followed his lead. Meredith found moments to speak with him between tasks, their conversations brief but increasingly weighted with unspoken feelings. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked on the second evening, finding him studying a rough map of the ranch he'd sketched out, some during the war, some after. His eyes remained on the map. "When I first came west, I scouted for the Army for a time. You learn to think about terrain, approach routes, defensive positions. You're very good at it." He looked up then, a hint of sadness in his smile. "Not a skill I ever thought I'd use to defend a ranch against American businessmen." "Is that how you see Carson? As just a businessman?" "No." Ethan's expression hardened. "Men like Carson use business as an excuse for conquest. They don't build, they take. They don't improve, they consume." Meredith was struck by the passion in his voice, so at odds with his usual measured tone. "You've encountered his kind before. Too many times." He folded the map, his movements precise. "I'm tired of watching them win, Meredith. Tired of good people being pushed aside in the name of progress or profit." Impulsively, she reached out, covering his hand with hers. "Then we won't let him win this time." Ethan turned his hand to clasp hers, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "If we get through this," he said quietly, "there's something I need to ask you, something important." Before Meredith could respond, a shout came from outside, "Riders coming." And the moment was gone. Ethan was on his feet, moving swiftly toward the door, his hand already on his gun. The approaching riders turned out to be friendly Thompson and his older sons, coming to join the ranch's defense. But the interruption left Meredith wondering what Ethan had been about to say. What question was so important it needed to wait for safety? That night, as she tried to sleep in the room she shared with Lily, Meredith found herself dwelling on possibilities. In the few short weeks since Ethan had intervened in that alley, her life had transformed completely. The prim schoolteacher from Boston had discovered depths of courage and conviction she hadn't known she possessed. And somewhere along the way, she had fallen in love with a man as complex and surprising as the Western landscape itself. The realization didn't shock her as much as she might have expected. Perhaps some part of her had known from that first night, when he had appeared like an avenging angel in the alley's shadows. Or perhaps it had grown gradually through their conversations, through the glimpses of the thoughtful, principled man beneath the quiet exterior. Either way, Meredith knew with sudden clarity that whatever Ethan wanted to ask her, her answer would be yes. Dawn broke on the third day with an unnatural stillness. The birds that usually announced morning with enthusiastic chorus were silent. The cattle in the near pastures had moved to the farthest corners, as if sensing approaching danger. Mason ordered everyone to their designated positions. Meredith and Lily were stationed in the house with two of the older hands, tasked with loading rifles and tending to any wounded who might be brought in. The waiting was excruciating, each minute stretching into what felt like hours. It was mid-morning when one of the boundary riders came galloping in, his horse nearly foundering beneath him. "They're coming," he shouted as he dismounted. Carson's men, at least 20, armed to the teeth. Mason's face was grim as he issued final orders. Ethan appeared at Meredith's side, his expression intent. "Stay inside, away from windows," he told her. "If firing starts, get to the root cellar with Lily. It's the safest place." "Be careful," Meredith said, fighting the urge to throw her arms around him, propriety be damned. Something in Ethan's eyes softened. "I will. I have reasons to be." Then he was gone, moving to take his position with Mason and the other men who would meet Carson's force at the ranch's main approach. Meredith watched from a second-floor window as Carson's men appeared on the ridge above the ranch. They paused there, a show of force, before starting down toward the defensive line Mason had established. In their midst rode Carson himself, immaculate as always, looking wildly out of place among his rough hired guns. The two groups faced each other across 50 yards of open ground. Even from her distant vantage point, Meredith could feel the tension crackling between them. Words were exchanged, though she couldn't make them out. Carson gestured expansively, his manner suggesting reasonable discussion rather than armed confrontation. Whatever he proposed was met with stone-faced refusal from Mason and his allies. The standoff continued for several minutes, neither side backing down. Then, unexpectedly, a rider appeared from the direction of Gold Hill, pushing his horse hard across the valley floor. The newcomer reached the confrontation and dismounted quickly, approaching both groups with what appeared to be a document in his hand. Even at a distance, Meredith recognized Sheriff Thomas, though his presence was puzzling. Why would Carson's ally intervene in a standoff that Carson himself had initiated? The tension on the field visibly shifted. Carson appeared to be arguing with Thomas now, his usual composure cracking. Mason and Ethan moved forward, examining whatever papers Thomas had brought. More heated discussion followed, with Carson becoming increasingly animated while his men exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, to Meredith's astonishment, Carson turned his horse and rode away, his men trailing behind him in obvious confusion. The ranchers remained in position until the last of Carson's force had disappeared over the ridge, clearly not trusting the unexpected retreat. Meredith rushed downstairs and out onto the porch, propriety forgotten in her need to understand what had happened. Lily was right behind her, her young face alight with hopeful confusion. Mason, Thomas, and Ethan were walking toward the house, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. Mason was actually laughing, clapping Thomas on the shoulder in a gesture of camaraderie that would have been unthinkable days earlier. "What happened?" Meredith called as they approached. "Why did they leave?" It was Thomas who answered, looking more like a proper sheriff than Meredith had ever seen him. "Telegram from the territorial governor," he explained, holding up the paper in his hand. "Arrived this morning. Carson's being investigated for fraud, water rights violations, and conspiracy to intimidate legal landowners." "The governor sent that to you?" Meredith asked, unable to hide her skepticism given Thomas's previous alignment with Carson. Thomas had the grace to look abashed. "Not exactly. It was sent to Judge Harmon, who arrived in Gold Hill last night, ahead of schedule. The judge made it clear that my cooperation would determine whether I faced charges of dereliction of duty myself. Thomas did the right thing in the end, Ethan said, his voice neutral but his eyes watchful on the sheriff. That's what matters now. Mason nodded agreement. Carson's finished in Gold Hill. The investigation will uncover enough to ensure that. His investors will abandon him once word gets out. The ranch erupted in celebration. Men who had been preparing to defend their lives and livelihoods now found themselves unexpectedly victorious without a shot fired. Bottles appeared, toasts were made, and the tension of the past days dissolved into relief and jubilation. In the midst of it all, Meredith found herself searching for Ethan. He wasn't among the celebrating ranchers, nor with Mason and Thomas as they discussed next steps. Finally, she spotted him walking alone toward the small rise behind the ranch house, away from the noise and activity. She followed him, somehow knowing he was seeking solitude not to avoid celebration but to process the sudden shift from imminent conflict to resolution. He heard her approach, turning to watch her climb the gentle slope toward him. "Is everything all right?" she asked as she reached him. "Yes," he said, though something in his expression suggested the answer wasn't so simple. "It's just unexpected. I've been in similar situations before, Meredith. They rarely end without bloodshed." "You sound almost disappointed," she observed, studying his face. "Not disappointed. Relieved." But also, he struggled for the words. When you prepare yourself for a fight, you build up certain defenses. When the fight doesn't come, those defenses don't just disappear. They need somewhere to go. Meredith understood. She had felt something similar in the aftermath of the confrontation, a nervous energy with no outlet, an emotional preparation with no resolution. What happens now? With Carson, with the ranch? Carson will likely leave the territory once the investigation begins in earnest. The ranch is safe. Mason's water rights will be confirmed by the territorial court. Ethan's gaze moved to the distant mountains. As for the rest, that depends. On what? He turned to face her fully, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. On you, Meredith. On whether you meant what you said about being tired of people like Carson winning. He took a deep breath. On whether you might consider a future here in Montana territory, with me. Meredith's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Ethan Vaughn? Not very well, apparently, he said with a hint of self-deprecating humor. Then his expression grew serious again. I love you, Meredith. I think I have since that night in the alley, though it took me some time to admit it to myself. I know we haven't known each other long by conventional standards, but out here, life doesn't always allow for lengthy courtships, Meredith finished for him, a smile beginning to bloom on her face. And sometimes, Ethan, you just know. Hope dawned in his eyes. Know what? That you found the person you're meant to find, that all the paths you've walked were leading you to them. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his eyes. I love you too, Ethan. I can't pinpoint when it happened, but I'm certain of it now. For a moment, he seemed unable to believe what he was hearing. Then, with infinite gentleness, he cupped her face in his hands. I don't have much to offer beyond myself, Meredith. Mason's offered me a stake in the Rockingham, a chance to build something permanent. But it would be a hard life, especially for a woman used to Eastern comforts. I didn't come west for comfort, Meredith replied, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I came for possibility, for a life that matters. And does this possibility include becoming a rancher's wife? Ethan asked softly. My wife. In answer, Meredith rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tender at first, then deepened as Ethan's arms encircled her, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the valley in gold and crimson. "I take it that's a yes," Ethan murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "Yes," Meredith confirmed, happiness bubbling through her like the clear waters of Cottonwood Creek. "Yes, Ethan Vaughn, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in Gold Hill's small church, with Mason giving away the bride and Lily serving as maid of honor. The town turned out in force, the recent troubles already fading into history as Carson had indeed fled the territory ahead of the governor's investigation. Mrs. Holloway sniffed disapprovingly about the unseemly haste, but nevertheless presented the couple with a handmade quilt of surprising beauty. Sheriff Thomas, newly committed to proper law enforcement, presented Ethan with a fine hunting rifle. And most touching of all, Meredith's students created a book of drawings and well wishes for their teacher and her new husband. The school board, freed from Carson's influence, had asked Meredith to continue teaching, arranging for a small cabin to be built near the schoolhouse for the newlyweds' use during the week. During weekends and school holidays, they would return to the Rocking M, where Ethan was already proving himself an invaluable partner to Mason in the ranch's operations. It wasn't the life Meredith had envisioned when she'd first arrived in Gold Hill, but as she and Ethan rode away from the church amid cheers and thrown flowers, she couldn't imagine wanting any other. The path had been unexpected, sometimes frightening, but it had led her to where she belonged beside a man whose quiet strength and profound goodness had captured her heart completely. 5 years later, Meredith stood on the porch of their home at the Rocking M, watching the sunset paint the valley in familiar gold. Behind her, the sounds of supper being prepared drifted through the open-door Lily, now 20 and engaged to a neighboring rancher's son, laughing with their cook Martha over some shared joke. The ranch had prospered in the years since Carson's departure. Under Mason and Ethan's joint leadership, the Rocking M had expanded its operations to include not just cattle, but also horse breeding, with several of their stock now sought after throughout the territory. Gold Hill had grown too, becoming the balanced community Mason had envisioned, supported by both mining, under new, more responsible ownership, and the surrounding agricultural enterprises. Meredith had continued teaching for 2 years after her marriage, eventually training a replacement when their first child was on the way. Now, with 3-year-old James toddling after his father in the corral and 1-year-old Sarah napping inside, Meredith found herself reflecting on how completely her life had transformed since that fateful evening in the alley. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Ethan was returning from the lower pastures, their son perched proudly in front of him on the saddle. James's face was alight with excitement, his small hands clutching the saddle horn while his father's arm kept him securely in place. As they drew near, Ethan lifted James down, setting the boy on his feet with a ruffle of his dark hair. "Go tell Aunt Lily supper better be ready. You and I have worked up quite an appetite." James scampered off, his childish voice soon heard announcing their arrival to the household at large. Ethan dismounted and led his horse toward Meredith, his smile warming as it always did when he saw her. 5 years of marriage had only deepened her love for him. The quiet strength that had first drawn her to him had proven to be just one facet of a complex, remarkable man. She had discovered his gentle patience with children, his dry humor that emerged in private moments, his unwavering loyalty to those he considered family. "You look thoughtful," he observed as he reached her, pressing a kiss to her forehead in greeting. "Just appreciating how fortunate we are," Meredith replied, leaning into his embrace. "Do you ever think about that night, when you stepped into that alley and changed both our lives?" "Often," Ethan admitted, his arms tightening slightly around her. "Though I didn't know then how completely it would change mine. I was just doing what seemed right at the moment. Those men. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Ethan shook his head. "No point in dwelling on what didn't happen. Better to be grateful for what did." He smiled down at her, the lines at the corners of his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. "And I am grateful, Meredith. Every day." From inside came the sound of Sarah waking, her demands for attention clear despite her limited vocabulary. James's voice joined hers, obviously impatient for the supper he'd been promised. "Our public awaits," Meredith said with a laugh, stepping back from Ethan's embrace. "Mason's joining us tonight. Lily's made apple pie." "A man could get used to such hardships," Ethan teased, taking her hand as they walked toward the house. As they crossed the threshold into the warm, noisy heart of their home, Meredith felt a profound contentment wash over her. The journey from that darkened alley to this moment had been unexpected, sometimes difficult, but ultimately more rewarding than she could have imagined. In Ethan, she had found not just safety but partnership, not just protection but profound love. Together, they had built a life that honored both his quiet strength and her determined spirit. And in doing so, they had discovered that the true measure of safety wasn't the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who would stand beside you, whatever came. For Meredith Owens Vaughn, that was a lesson worth learning, and a life worth living here in the wild beauty of Montana territory, with the man who had once guided her to safety and now guided her to joy, day after day, forever.